Do we want to take questions?
Yeah, that's fine. If folks have questions, they can come up to either of these two queues on the side aisles here. Just come on down. Someone's making their way.
Hi, Chris. This question's basically for you. I'm sure you're aware that Semiotex is having a show at 356 Mission, where basically that place is, being displacing people, and there's a boycott called on by various activist groups in Boyle Heights, and I just want to know whether or not you're going to pull out of that.
So it's a question about the Boyle Heights boycott and whether or not you're going to relocate your book event from the gallery so that you don't have to cross the picket line.
Yeah, we're not going to relocate. We're not going to relocate the event.
Can I ask why? Or why? What compels you to actually think that it's okay to displace people, to be a part of this organization that is displacing a neighborhood in Boyle Heights?
She wants to know why you won't do it, and about, particularly about the displacement in the neighborhood that the art gallery is a part of.
You know, it would be really good if people from your group show up to that event and we can have this conversation at that event. This event really is about after Kathy Acker and the work of Ann Boyer and Ariana and Gabby. So I don't want to hijack that conversation. We should have this conversation later. I'm happy to have it with you. Okay?
It's the same event. Why can't we just have that conversation now?
Tonight is about Kathy Acker. I'm really sorry. I appreciate that you brought it up at a public forum, but I'd ask out of respect for Chris Kraus and Ann Boyer and Ariana that you let it go for now. I'm sure she'd be willing to talk to you afterwards. Yeah, please.
Oh, will you come up to the mic so everyone can hear? Can you please sit down? I'm really uncomfortable with this.
Hi guys, hi Ariana, it's good to see you again. So just listening to you guys talk about, especially Ariana talking about the novel kind of being, or a piece of work, a piece of work being like having a kind of transgression, and it can kind of be a little bit crazy. And I think about Eileen Myles, and to paraphrase what she said like the world is crazy, but why should a novel or why should a piece of work not be kind of crazy as well, if it kind of just reflects that. So I'm just wondering if you guys have any thoughts about that, and how that kind of manifests itself in the work that you guys are talking about.
I hope I'm going to translate this correctly. So the Eileen Myles quote about the world being crazy, so why shouldn't literature be crazy too?
Yes.
Yes, and so he wants to apply that to the context of Acker's work?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that observation goes way, way back in poetic lineages. It's definitely, Acker used that logic in her work. I write about some of the people who were her predecessors who also came to the same conclusions. Jean-Pierre Fay in Paris and the Change Group in the 1970s, they came to exactly the same conclusion, that poetry had to be disjunctive and ruptured to reflect the fragmentation of consciousness and the world as they knew it. I mean, the Dadaists reached the same conclusion in 1915. People have been reaching that conclusion for a long time. It was true then, and it's true now. And Acker's work manifests that really beautifully, and she's incredibly articulate about that.
I think that perhaps one of the peculiarities, though, is why is one thing just like a weird pile of crap, and another thing feels like an accurate reflection of the insanity of our world, you know? And I think we're living in a time that the envelope itself of reality is shifting really radically every second to the point where we can feel it in our bodies, right? And there's a lot of very, very urgent, catastrophic changes happening all the time. Also, like the changes that are happening in the neighborhood in Boyle Heights, and that where people are trying to respond to it in a new way, so that gentrification doesn't just have to be this inexorable thing, or that Puerto Rico doesn't have to be completely underwater, or whatever these ruptures are that we're dealing with. I think that on the one hand, I agree with Eileen that artwork should be crazier, and I suppose I was stumping for that a few moments ago, right? And I think, but in a way, it's a little bit more existential. Like I feel like what I'm asking, what I wish that people would do when they write and when they search themselves in relationship to other people, is to ransack themselves a little harder, just push it a little more. Because this holograph that we're in is like stretchy, and we don't know, it doesn't have to go one way or another. And so, but then, so to take this silly putty back to the artwork, the question of the space of an artwork, rather than like the space of a theater, or the space of a protest, or the space of your body with your feed on your phone, or whatever. Inside of an artwork, to have it hold together, to have some kind of a structure that can contain all this insanity is still tricky. It's not as simple as just like vomiting it up onto the page or the screen or whatever. And that is something that I feel, maybe as a poet, and I'm in the ghetto totally of poetry, for me it has to do with the measure of my own breath. But there will be something formal, and it won't be the same for you as it would be for somebody else. There will be something, I think in Kathy's case, a lot of it was about investigating the structure of myth, that will help you make a container so that you can reflect all of this craziness accurately, but it won't just feel like cat puke.
Yeah. I want to say something because I was thinking about the relationship of the displacement boycott and Acker and politics and all those little competing lies inside of the big lie, right, about the respectability politics around breast cancer, around women's death, all of it. And I support the boycott. I think that it's like, it's not even an either or, but I mean, so we disagree, we can talk about it. It's not an either or, like we can have our art and we can have places to talk about books, and we don't have to destroy neighborhoods in order to do that. But I've always wondered with Acker about her politics. I mean, I think sort of a general poetic kind of anarchism, right? This is what I read as the politics of Acker, like the general state of statelessness or rebellion against the state. But I wondered if she had political commitments, and if you came across these at all in your research.
Well, her politics were more, in terms of analysis and recognition. She wasn't an activist per se. I didn't come across any instances of her doing any activist work. But her writing was an activist work in itself of consciousness. She had a very clear perception of the nature of simulation and mediatized reality. She understood that very early on, before a lot of other people did. You know, as early as that 1976 interview, 1974, she's saying that culture is just a rag bag. Everything is completely exchangeable. You know, it's an image world. Other people were very, you know, still trying to give a very sensible analysis, as if things could be explained from a point of rationality. And she really saw that. In fact, in 1971, she writes, I think the real power is with the 1%.
Yes, I remember
And
that.
not the nine. I mean, the 1% versus the 99%. She, you know, she said that in 1971.
Are there other questions? Do you have other questions?
I'm enjoying the silence.
I guess speaking of silence, I'm really curious about which of her silences you chose to protect.
Is this a question for Chris?
Yeah, it was. Unless we want to call it a night, which is also fine.
She wants to know which of Acker's silences did you choose to protect, if any?
You mean silences in her writing?
No, just like with all the elaborate fictions that she created around her life, and then all the ways that she was exposed, there were also a lot of, you know, like areas that were never exposed and not even lied about. You know, they lived in the dark recesses. So how did you choose? I mean, were there certain things that you refused to go into that you decided not to shine a light on in order to protect certain elements of her, you know, creativity or soul?
So did you choose to not go into certain things, to just leave them be?
I think I was more concerned about protecting civilians. You know, she's a writer. She was using life material. Pretty much anything in her life is discussable. She raised it first. But other people in her life, there were some things that that I uncovered in the research that were not flattering to those people, and there was no reason to disclose it. You know, people said things that maybe they shouldn't have said at the time, and it would have made a more vivid story maybe, but the damage seemed much greater than the benefit.
I think we're done. Thank you everyone for coming.
I have a question, sorry, if you'll have me. Hello, everyone. I grew up reading the semio textbooks, and they really impacted my understanding of the world and like how we can carry struggles of political significance. And in your work specifically has been very inspiring, specifically Where Art Belongs and other such books. So, and you know, which is why it's so kind of disheartening or almost hypocritical that we're asking to have a conversation. I know you said let's have a conversation there, but like there's all these talks about like ghettos that have been heard here tonight, and like we're right now in like the white intellectual ghetto of the West. Stokely Carmichael's words, not mine. So there's no reason why we shouldn't have a conversation like that here. I know people here and other people here are interested in having that. And specifically coming back to like semiotext legacy and your work as like, you know, like an orientation. I know for me growing up and reading these things, I was like, there are things we can do to address all these problems who are structural, and specifically looking at art and how art exists in the market and like how art like engages with real estate and value and does all these things. And sometimes we as artists or like people who consider themselves artists don't think about these things and go around being like, oh, okay, I'm gonna do my art, I'm gonna change the world, I'm gonna transgress. When like we've left very clear that neoliberal capital just like eats that stuff up, right?
Let me tell her.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
It's going to be brief. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
but
go ahead.
He said that semiotext has had a huge impact on his belief that the world can change and that we can analyze it, and that your work too has this impact on people, which at just an aside, I think is true. And so I think he's trying to reconcile the Boyle Heights, crossing that picket line, with the great work that semiotics and you do about thinking about ways outside of this monstrous trap of capitalism, right? Of this impossible set of circumstances that we've been given to try to make lives out of. I'm sorry, I'm editorializing.
That's fine.
But so he wants but he wants to know how. And I mean, I think this is probably a fair question with Acker too. That question of is it enough for the books to do it, or do we also have to do it with our bodies, right? Do we also have to make the change with our bodies? There's a question.
I guess we just really would like to ask you to move the event somewhere else. Just precisely because your reputation and a lot of like our standing is staked on it. Precisely because of that, we think it's so important, because it would be so powerful for everyone who reads your work and who has a stake in it and who is invested in it to be able to see these very concrete gestures and how they could help us in our struggle or deeply like work against us. Thank you.
How important you are and how important it would be if you made this decision.
Well,
thank you for doing that.
thank you. My collaborators and I with semiotext, we all believe that activism is very important. And I think each of us have been involved in different activist things at different times. This particular case, there are reasons why we decided to maintain the event, and I'd be happy to talk with you about them, but this really is not the best venue for it. Okay, it's disrespectful to the people who came for another reason.
They're still here and would love to have the conversation now. And he said, what are the reasons? What are the reasons that you're staying in the location?
Oh, well, as I said, I'd like to discuss them in another setting. This is not the right setting to talk about this in.
And if everyone wants some context, you can look up Boyle Heights and the anti-gentrification movement. It's a set of neighbors and artists who are working to resist real estate profiteers in that neighborhood. And so part of this, you know, artists always have a lot of symposiums about gentrification. I know at least in Kansas City where I'm from, there's like a whole lot of people sitting around and talking about it. And so I think this is a new way of dealing with that. And so this is all obviously a contested issue, and I'm sure that we'll keep talking about it, but I want you also to, if you're not aware of what's going on, to look it up and read about what everyone is doing in LA to try to keep the neighborhood intact, not sacrifice people in the name of art, in the name of profit.
Yeah. There's a page for Defend Boyle Heights. There's another page for Defend Boyle Heights from Defend Boyle Heights. So people can read those two sides and, you know, start to have a...
There's also BAD, which is Boyle Heights against art washing and displacement.
And she's referencing an alt-right Facebook page.
Okay, we've got to call this a night. Thanks, everyone.
Aren't you glad you knew about this before you came here?
I know like 7 minutes on my phone.
Thank you for that.
I'm just so glad you did not have to learn about it on stage. Yeah. Yeah.